Well, nowadays there's an increasing trend toward ecotourism holidays. So, what is ecotourism? Well, it's a form of tourism which should not only protect but also actively improve our environment and its cultures. However, many forms of tourism which are presented as sustainable, nature-based, and environmentally friendly are often not what they seem, and this is rapidly becoming a somewhat thorny issue. Governments, as well as the tourism industry, promote ecotourism, but there are very well-founded concerns that in many instances it not only lacks adequate scientific foundations, but is also not viable as a solution to the world's social and environmental problems, which, of course, is what ecotourism is supposed to be about. Many ecotourism holidays are really nothing more than a marketing ploy, and indeed, in the worst cases, can be said to even threaten local cultures, economies, and natural resource bases. The issue is further confused by the multitude of terms to describe types of travel which supposedly protect the environment. Other than ecotourism, we have adventure travel, sustainable tourism, responsible tourism, nature-based travel, green travel, and cultural tourism, to name just a few. So the problem we have here is whether a potential traveler who wants a legitimately environmentally friendly travel experience can make the right choice when confronted with this type of marketing.
The earliest writers on politics, and I'm thinking of Plato and Aristotle here, felt free to draw insights from all areas of human knowledge, unlike modern academic writers who tend to put things into smaller and smaller compartments or focus more closely on one area of inquiry. For example, Plato would examine a whole political system and the philosophy that underlies it, whereas modern writers on politics might concentrate on one particular institution in that system, the House of Lords in England, or on voting patterns within a country. With this focus, the bigger questions that the ancients dealt with, what is the best form of government, or what is justice, tend to get left behind. Many writers on politics these days are university-based, and so have to have specialised interests. And while they may make new and interesting discoveries in their special field, it is at the loss of a broader perspective, not to mention the loss of a general audience or readership. In the 19th century, there were still writers who used the same freedom of inquiry as the ancients, and are all the more readable and relevant because of it.
The assignment that I'm going to set for the holiday period is one that we've given students for a number of years. It's quite practical and will allow you to get out and about. It's no good being shut up in your rooms all the time. It does have a written element too. Basically, it's a data gathering exercise, and there are two choices with regard to how you collect the data. We'll go through those in a moment. I'm also going to give you a link to an internet site that is, well, it's critical that you review this before you do anything, as it provides a lot of guidance on data presentation, both in terms of how you plot it, its diagrammatic form, and also its description, which has to be clear.
This week we're going to be continuing our discussion of women in society. Last week we looked at a number of issues relating to women in education. If you remember, we discussed women both at school and at university. Today we're going to be considering the roles that women play in the workplace. Again, we'll start by taking a historical perspective, and inevitably you'll find that many of the same events that impacted on women in education also had a major influence on their working lives. In the second half of the lecture, I'll concentrate on the situation in Europe today, and I'll invite you to suggest how you think things are likely to develop over the next decade. Okay, so let's get started. To be honest, the biggest problem for most undergraduate students, in terms of academic writing, is not only adapting to a far more structured and formal style, but also learning how to ascertain the difference between important, valid information and unnecessary, or even irrelevant material. In my experience, I would say it takes students their first year, if not longer, to appreciate what is required and to start to implement those requirements in their writing. What they really should be doing, if they are struggling with written assignments, is to seek help from the excellent support services which are available at the university. I want to look now at the three main approaches historians have taken towards the English Revolution or Civil War. There is a fourth point of view, taken up by most schoolchildren when they first meet the subject, but it can hardly be called historical. On the one hand, schoolchildren tend to have a romantic image of the Cavaliers, who were supporters of the monarchy, as aristocratic, charming, flashily dressed, and up for a bit of fun. On the other hand, they tend to regard the Roundheads or Puritans, who were followers of Oliver Cromwell, as miserable, working class, dressed in black, and insisting on a life without luxuries. It isn't difficult then to take sides. The first approach, which prevailed up until the middle of the 20th century, was that the revolution was part of the age-old battle between Parliament and the monarchy, with Parliament representing the traditional rights of Englishmen against the attempt by the royal family to increase its power and dictate law. In reaction to this, the second approach saw it as a working-class revolution and an important stage in the development of capitalism. In other words, they saw it as a class war, and a forerunner of the French Revolution and those that came after. Historians who supported the third approach saw that things weren't as clear-cut as the others thought. Instead of seeing the revolution as the result of long-term trends in the country's history, and therefore almost unavoidable, they focused on the details of the period immediately leading up to its outbreak and allowed for its unpredictability. The two sides, also, weren't so clear-cut, with some aristocrats supporting Parliament and some members of the working class fighting on the side of the monarchy. How did I get into anthropology? Well, I'm not an anthropologist, not trained in it anyway. In fact, I'm a marine biologist, and it's more that I'm interested in the strandlopers, the beach walkers, if you like, than in anthropology generally. In fact, it was through my early interest in all things to do with the sea that I first heard of them. As a kid, my favorite pastime was getting down to the beach and mucking about in rock pools and collecting anything the sea tossed up, and, the strandlopers lived off the sea and seashore gathering food such as mussels, oysters, crabs, and so on, just as I did. So when I heard of them I thought, right, this is my kind of thing, and I felt a kind of, affinity for them. At first people thought they were a myth, I suppose because there didn't seem to be much evidence for their existence, but now we do have archaeological evidence such as pottery, discarded shells, the bones of seals and large fish, and so on. And those shells, we believe, became their first tools, and in some cases were also used as money and jewelry. Of course, before they had the implements, the tools to hunt and fish, everything had to be caught by hand, so they kept mostly to shallow water. Then they might have used a primitive form of fishing line, perhaps the tendril of a climbing plant or a strip of animal skin with a bone or small piece of wood that would stick in the fish's throat. Anyway, the more we search the more we discover. Most recently, caves on the coast have been discovered with ancient drawings. I'll find it endlessly fascinating. It is claimed, by neuroscientists among others, that speaking 2 or more languages increases cognitive abilities and in some way re-wires the brain, as it were, in a way that positively affects how the brain works. And it's true that we tend to think of people who can speak 2 or more languages as being bright. Learning a language is, anyway, good mental exercise, not to mention its benefits in introducing you to other peoples and cultures. This is why all school curricula should include at least one compulsory language. Anyone who knows 2 languages will find in certain circumstances, they compete for position, the vocabulary of one getting in the way of the other. Often bi- or multilingual people find one language more suitable for expressing certain kinds of thoughts or feelings. There is another view on being bilingual, not from a neuroscientist, but from someone whose business involves words and language. Brought up in a bilingual home, speaking Greek and French, and also fluent in English, she is old enough to remember when her native language, Greek, was also in effect 2 languages. There was the formal, correct form, katharissa, which was taught and spoken in schools, written in newspapers and books, and so on, and the everyday demotic language you used with your friends. As for her view on bilingualism, she says that you end up with a split personality. Map making has a long and fascinating HI story. Both before Ptolemy produced the first great map of the world and after, up to the beautiful simplicity of the London Underground map and the precisely detailed Ordnance Survey maps, which cover almost every inch of the United Kingdom. Ancient mapmakers used to draw in hills, valleys and rivers to give an idea of the topography, the shape of the land. It wasn't until the late 16th century that contour lines were used, that is, lines that linked points of the land at the same height. But this was to show the relative depths and shallows of a river. The first time land contours were used was on a map of France, which took about 40 years to complete, and was finished in 1783. The Ordnance Survey was set up in 1791 and their maps, as the name suggests, were originally made for military purposes, and the first one to be produced was of the county of Kent at a ratio of 1 inch to 1 mile.
Most, if not all, young men and women have dreams of the future which include themselves, their families, and possibly their country. At one time or another, they evaluate and criticize their own society and think of the changes they would like to make. For most people, however, the biggest contribution they can make to their society's development and change is through the careers they will follow, rather than through direct political action. For the lucky few, their careers will be interesting as well as allowing them to make a measurable contribution to the growth of their country. This is why it is important to know something about the career aspirations of young people and the reasons for their interest in these ideal careers. At the same time, it is equally important to consider whether their aspirations are
How much the Earth's climate will change in the future depends, among other things, on how quickly and to what extent the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere increases. If we take no action to limit future greenhouse gas emissions, it is estimated that there will be a rise in temperature of 0.2 to 0.3 degrees Celsius every 10 years. This is a far greater rate of warming than anything that has occurred over the past 10,000 years. One set of predictions claims that some regions of the world will warm more quickly than others, and rainfall will also increase in some areas and decrease in others. These changes will affect the sea level, which could rise by 50 centimetres over the next century. All this will affect humans through the effects it has on water resources.
It's Friday the 13th.
You've got to ask yourself the question, do I feel lucky?
If you don't, you could be suffering from triskaidekaphobia. That's a fear of the number 13. Napoleon, Herbert Hoover, and FDR are well-documented triskaidekaphobics. But why do folks think 13 is unlucky, particularly when it falls on a Friday, as it will 3 times this year? The University of Delaware's Thomas Fernsler is known as Dr. 13. He's an expert on the number's bad reputation, which may date back to biblical times. After all, the 13th guest at the Last Supper was Judas, and you know how that worked out for Jesus, who was crucified on a Friday. Other factoids from Fernsler: the first person to die in a car accident was killed in New York City on September the 13th in 1899, although that was a Wednesday. And the ill-fated flight of Apollo the 13th launched at the 13th minute of the 13th hour, Central Standard Time, on April 11th, 1970. And the numerals in the date 4/11/70 add up to, gasp, 13, as long as you don't include the 19 in 1970. Hey, sometimes superstition can be hard work. Today, some tall buildings lack a 13th floor. Well, they have a 13th floor, but they call it the 14th floor, because the purveyors of bad luck are apparently easily fooled. Meanwhile, over in France, panicky Parisian party throwers can even hire a quatorzième, a professional 14th guest. Like Judas, Mark Twain was allegedly once poised to be the 13th guest at a dinner party. A superstitious friend warned the very rational Twain not to go, but Twain went. It was bad luck, he later remarked. They only had food for 12.
It followed from the special theory of relativity that mass and energy are different manifestations of the same thing.
Now researchers have stopped light cold and then brought it back to life, or light, in an entirely different place. The Harvard researchers sent a light pulse into a sodium cloud cooled to about 460 degrees below zero. That's the theoretical point where matter stops all movement. The light pulse was compressed by a factor of about 50 million at the extreme temperature, and it actually changed state, sort of like frozen water. But it also split into 2 forms of matter. One stayed frozen in the sodium, while the other crawled along at just 200 meters per hour. That second form, called a matter wave, contains the exact information of the original light wave. And when researchers sent it into a second sodium cloud a fraction of a millimeter away, the wave was converted back into light. And since fiber optic communications use light, that means that someday we may be able to stop them, store them, and turn them back on, just like a light switch.
The undergraduates need some specific sources to analyze a program. The department will continue to offer 3 new scholarships next year. Dogs are able to provide assistance to people with disabilities. Popular culture is now a serious subject of academic inquiry.